Hello and warm greetings to all. I must begin by thanking Overman Foundation for organizing this series of talks on the future poetry, and I'm grateful for being given the opportunity of delivering on Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry and poetics. In this talk, I'm going to introduce the book The Future Poetry by Sri Aurobindo and what it is all about. To talk about the future poetry written by Sri Aurobindo, I must say that it is an invaluable book on any principle of criticism. We know how great a poet he was, alongside being a Mahayogi. We have read his poems and perhaps are well acquainted with his great and noble and sublime poem Savitri. But we have perhaps neglected or relegated to the background Sri Aurobindo's grand and unique theory of poetry, his poetics, his aesthetics, which are, interestingly enough, commensurate with his philosophy of evolution of consciousness. Though his poetry has been analyzed and commented upon in a noteworthy way by eminent scholars, and his poetics too, yet the future poetry as a book hasn't been given a comprehensive study. And we have to remember that the future poetry, together with the thousands of letters and correspondences which he shared with others, these give us the main body of Aurobindonian poetics. And how he put his own theories into practice, we can know from his wonderfully crafted poetic pieces, which are actually brilliant execution of his theories of poetry and poet. But here I have my reservations in talking about it as theory. For it's not a mere theory, it's a grand philosophy in itself. For Sri Aurobindo has constructed a philosophy, as we find here, in addition to engaging in practical criticism. And Sri Aurobindo here is both critic and philosopher, and these are not distanced from each other. But here, when I say philosophy instead of theory, we see how theories are exceeded and superseded here, and a new synthesis, a novel poetics of the future poetry emerges. The future poetry, which has received less of critical attention comparatively, is a useful book, helpful in understanding much about Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of artistic creation and also poetry in general. So let us bring it back in focus and see how it is relevant for our present times and, of course, how it shall aid the future poets and their works. This is another facet of the diamond to be discovered, to quote a great critic's words used in a different context, of course. So let us begin our journey, and I'm sure we'll gather some valuable treasures along the way. A brief glance at this point at the chronology of the book tells us that it was a series of 32 essays or articles published in the area between December 1917 and July 1920. But it was more than these 2.5 years of effort. For Sri Aurobindo revised these writings more than once. Almost a decade after their first publication, in the early 1930s, he took up 17 chapters for revision. Not yet fully satisfied, and with newer ideas and thoughts perhaps, the Mahayogi and Mahakavi Sri Aurobindo took it up again for the last revisions, adding and altering the existing texts And in this way, at least 20 chapters came to be revised and re-revised, as 13 of these chapters had undergone the first revision already. Now, my point in dwelling on the bibliographical details is only to show how important a work it was considered by its author. And we can just about do a little justice to this immensely valuable, thought provokingly critical work if we give it a careful study. In fact, it is said that the creative process includes the entire sequence from the origin of the work up to those last revisions, which sometimes are the most genuinely creative part of the whole. So we see on any account, it is a creative work of Sri Aurobindo like any other. Now, the Future Poetry, published posthumously in 1953 as a book, is the basis of understanding Sri Aurobindo's poetics and also a valuable guide to comprehend some of the creative processes of the writings of Sri Aurobindo himself, as we find in his poetic compositions, and which include short lyrics, sonnets, long narrative poems, epics, all. Okay, so now let us take up the book itself, The Future Poetry. It has a very interesting name, but more interesting is the fact that Sri Aurobindo deals here not only with future poetry, but also elaborately with the poetry of the past, before going on to predict the future of poetry. The evolution of poetry, or the evolutionary character of poetry, we may say, is the theme and subject of his study, culminating in his prophecy of what poets and poetry of the future will be like. So we are going to talk poetry over here. We are going to deal with poetry. So what happens when we take up a poem? When we read a poem, what do we get out of it? What do we expect to get? We have the melody, the rhythm, if we can attune our ears to it, and then probably the meaning of the poem, whatever we can take out, whatever we can extract. We try to understand the message of the poet. So why are we talking poetry over here? Do we seek entertainment from poetry? Do we seek pleasure? Do we seek lessons that the poet is trying to give us? Do we expect to be acquainted with the reality, or do we expect to be enchanted and transported to another world? So let us look at some lines of poetry. It's a random selection from various poets belonging to different ages and milieus. So look at these lines, how very melodious these are. When the poet says about his love, he's addressing his beloved and he says, "Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. So fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas go dry." So we sway with the music, the melody. That's Robert Burns for us. Or listen to some very well-known lines by the great poet Shelley, where he say, "We look before and after, and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought." Very well-known lines. And we listen, we ponder on these lines, and we try to understand what the poet means. Or take these lines, this time from one of Sri Aurobindo's poems. He writes, "Light, endless light, darkness has room no more. Life's ignorant gulfs give up their secrecy, the huge inconscient depths unplumbed before lie glimmering in vast expectancy. Light, timeless light, immutable and apart, the holy sealed mysterious doors unclose. Light, burning light, from the infinite's diamond heart, quivers in my heart where blooms the deathless rose. So, what do we get when we listen to poetry? What do we get when we read poetry, when we look at poetry, even when we hold and seize the poem, so to speak, the body of the poem? We have the sound of music, melodious lines, rhyme scheme, a good rhyme scheme, and images which trigger our mind. And what else? Perhaps when we delve a little deeper, we can extract some philosophical truth out of a poem or some metaphysical idea. Yet, there is a lot more to poetry. Poetry is not a substitute for philosophy, though there may be philosophical truth in it in its ideological content. But there's more to poetry, and poetry as such has its own aims and justifications. So, a poem, it has so many sides to it, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube, we can say. And there can be a lot more to poetry, as we find here Sri Aurobindo defining its many contours, and his broad sweep includes poetry, poet, reader, audience, rhythm, substance, speech, language, and their relation and interaction and interdependence. And of course, the role and value of the different grades of consciousness in the art of poetry making or creating. This is something uniquely Aurobindonian. Now, if we glance through the contents of Sri Aurobindo's book, we see it begins with a very important chapter which he titles the Mantra. And the succeeding chapters go on to define and comment on the essence of poetry, its movement and style, and substance and rhythm and poetic vision. Now, here I'll just put in a word or two about the mantra, which otherwise needs detailed study. Now, mantra, what do we mean by this mantra? In a letter of later years, Sri Aurobindo wrote about poetry that it is a question of the right concentrated silence or seeking somewhere in the mind with the right openness to the word that is trying to express itself. For the word is there ready to descend in those inner planes where all artistic forms take birth. And when we have the right word, the true word, the rhythmic word, directly from higher sources, we have the mantra. Now, there's no exact equivalence of the word in English, but mantra is something universal. The mantra is neither of the future nor of the ancient past alone, but of both. It is of eternity. And in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, especially of the future poetry, the mantra has a special place. Of course, we shall have occasions to deal with this in plenty, and we'll see how Sri Aurobindo arrives at his theory of mantric poetry. So, for the time being, we can take up the first chapter of the future poetry. Curiously enough, the first part of the book, The Future Poetry, is a comment and critical analysis of the course and character of English poetry. Now, here we may recall a little biographical detail about Sri Aurobindo's early life, which is very relevant here. He spent a good many formative years of his childhood and early youth in England. While there, he came in touch with and lived with and under the influence of European and English literature and culture. So he was well acquainted and well versed in these and productively imbibed the spirit of cultural Europe and England. And in the future poetry, when we find him dealing with English poetry from its Anglo Saxon roots and up to its progress and character in Victorian times with elaborate comments, we must know that we are listening to the opinions of an expert, of one who could write on this with the confidence of a master. Thus, we have in the future poetry Sri Aurobindo's own analysis of the character of major and important phases of English poetry, pointing out both its strength and imperfections and the influences on this poetry and the movement of modern, that is, the 18th and 19th century poetry. And also, we have a master critic's extensive comments on individual poets like Byron, Wordsworth, Blake, and contemporary poets like Carpenter, Whitman, and some others. But what is very interesting is, as we shall see later on, Sri Aurobindo's estimation of the ultimate aesthetic value of these poets' works and their artistic purpose, showing how they prepare new ways for a future poetry. This is what lies in store for us in the first part of Sri Aurobindo's book. The second part, we can say, is a sort of continuation of the first in the sense that here Sri Aurobindo writes about the kind of poetry we may expect in future, and that amply satisfies and justifies the title of the book, The Future Poetry. And in the second part, we have bagfuls of gems to collect for sure as we explore, along with Sri Aurobindo, the spaces of poetry and read about his perceptive discourse on the spiritual dimensions of poetry, on the wonderful theory of delight and beauty in poetry, and the marvelous philosophy of the 5 sons of poetic truth. Okay, so another important point we may mention over here, and that is, as we have been saying, Sri Aurobindo devotes a good part of the book to English poetry and poets, yet his vision is rooted in the wisdom of the Vedas and the Upanishads. He was one who was deeply conscious of his Indian roots. And his theory of poetry, his critique of poetry, his way and method of criticism, as in the future poetry, is markedly different from those of other critics and philosophers and theorists. And what makes it as such is something that is fundamental in Aurobindonian philosophy. That is his distinction between the vital, mental, and spiritual levels of existence and consciousness. And to use Sri Aurobindo's own words, here we get criticism which forces us both to see and think. So basically, what we get here is poetry from a spiritual standpoint. Now, of course, this may pose a difficulty in comprehension, and especially in a high technical age like ours, when spirit and spiritual and spiritualism and spirituality, these are more often than not tossed out as imaginary coinages and perhaps stand meaningless. Yet, if read in the right spirit, with even a humble aim to comprehend some of its contents, the future poetry by Sri Aurobindo itself becomes an experience of a unique kind, taking us along a journey into the mind of the great poet himself and also along yet unseen paths of the world of future poetry. Okay, so before we actually go on for a detailed study of the book, let us briefly try to know about what actually inspired Sri Aurobindo to talk and write about poetry in such a way as this. He himself has given us explanations, and we have this in the very first chapter of the book. Sri Aurobindo, as he found it in his times, talks about the condition, or rather, the literary cultural standard of Indians. That is, as he found it in his own days. And he makes, how shall we put it, he makes very bold statements. The kind of statement which would perhaps, spark off enormous debates on parallel news channels in our times. So I suppose you know what I mean. That is Sri Aurobindo, writing in the early decades of the 20th century, felt that India had become the most provincial of provinces. Now imagine, making a statement like that. And he regretted that this should be the condition of India and Indians. Talking of cultural provincialism or even lingual or political, now just to deflect a moment from Sri Aurobindo's main discourse, but continuing on the thread of this comment of his, we can ask ourselves, that is, even today, 100 years after Sri Aurobindo had uttered this, can we say we are completely rid of the evil of provincialism? In fact, more so today. Day by day, we are falling into its narrow grooves. But that must remain a matter of debate. So, to come back to what Sri Aurobindo was writing about, he felt, and rightly so, that India once had been one of the greatest centers of civilization. What has happened now? Blame it on provincialism of the Indian mind? And on top of that, there was a vigorous revival of the spirit of cultural patriotism in those times. So, in spite of these two factors, these two movements, historical and contemporary, India, Sri Aurobindo felt, was lagging in other vital areas. Now, mind you, he's talking here not of the general ignorance of the masses, but here he's talking of the ignorance of the literate mass, that is, their lack of cultural literary consciousness. Okay. Indians had little access to or very little interest in a wide and sound information. And as Sri Aurobindo said, they needed a richer stuff to work upon. What the Indians had, what they already had in the literary cultural field was not sufficient. They needed to come in larger contact with, needed a more vital touch with the world around. They needed to know more about what was happening in the world around them. Now, of course, he's writing in the first decades of the 20th century, when there was no internet, no Google, no YouTube or Netflix and news channels. But once more, to stray just an inch from our main discourse, today we have all this at our disposal. We have let ourselves be invaded with technology. We have plethora of devices and knowledge and information tools at our disposal. Even then, very few of us can claim to be knowledgeable in that sense. And how many of us can claim to be aware of all that is going on around the world? And how many of us can claim to have taken the best possible advantage of technology to widen our horizons of knowledge? A minuscule of the population. And literature and culture, where these are concerned, this forms a minuscule of that minuscule. So, to go back to what Sri Aurobindo was writing about in the early 20th century, and he had observed the situation so well. So, the question was, what was to be our window to the wide space, the huge literary cultural arena of the world? What could be our means and methods? This was what prompted Sri Aurobindo to write a whole book on poetry and future poetry. So, books, that's the first thing that comes to mind, because in those times, books were perhaps the best aids. The Indian mind gone provincial, the Indian out of touch with the culture of the outer world, this, Sri Aurobindo felt, was a great loss. It was a malady. This intellectual remoteness of India, to put it in his own words, he feels bitterly about this loss and condemns it in passionate words, saying that in the things of culture, such a state of ignorance is unholy, and he calls it a state of sin. See how deeply he felt this. So, what could be the remedy? As Sri Aurobindo said, and not without a note of regret, that Indians were content with their narrow views, satisfied with their limited knowledge, especially as far as literature was concerned. Beyond their own culture, their knowledge of other cultures and literature extended only to English language and literature, and even here did not stretch beyond the more popular names like those of Tennyson or Shelley, perhaps. Now, Sri Aurobindo, who was a great resource of knowledge in himself, who was himself in touch with continental rather than with only contemporary English literature, felt this lacune and sought to provide some nourishment for the Indian mind. Along with the intellectual remoteness, which was cause for concern enough, Sri Aurobindo also referred to the poorly trained critical intelligence of the Indians. Later on in the book, he has had a lot to discuss on the art of criticism, as we shall see. Now, there was need for something more, something heavier and more substantial than what he called mere finger posts. So he himself was quite dissatisfied with the cultural, literary condition of the Indians, the Indian mind. And in those times, as he observed, there were very small, insufficient openings, narrow avenues for the Indian mind to come in touch with and be acquainted with the world at large. Now, it's true that exchanges of all kinds were taking place in those years, and Indians had the opportunity of coming into contact with the other world. There were cultural interchanges, and English education had also been introduced in the system. But this was only too little, and it is in this context that Sri Aurobindo refers to the book New Ways in English Literature and its author James Couzens. Now, here again, It may strike us as strange as to why Sri Aurobindo should select a book by Cousins for his own discourse on poetry. But we needn't seek far for answers. We needn't grope in the void of guesses and surmises. As Sri Aurobindo himself tells us that this particular book by James Cousins was a good guide and could be a great help for the Indians to make up for their deficiency in the literary field which Sri Aurobindo has been talking about. So, who is James Cousins and what is his book New Ways in English Literature all about, which Sri Aurobindo makes the starting point of his own essays on poetry? And more importantly, how and why does this book form part of Sri Aurobindo's essay on the mantra? So we'll look into this further and continue to explore more of the future poetry in our future talks. So thank you for today.